Oh, good afternoon, everyone, and we'll begin. It's time. So let me, as I have done, and so it should be all very clear what the expectations are for your term paper. Counts 20% of your grade. It's 800 words. Please stay within that word limit. It is due on Friday, the 4th of December. So that'll be the end of review week. That's the week after week 13. Again, as has been said several times now, select an example of what is generally regarded as verbal art. Now, I hope by now all of you have selected an example, and it can be a poem, movie script, an extract from a novel, a speech, a song, anything along those lines. But one requirement that you do need to pay attention to, and that is you need to cite sources that support your claim that this is indeed valued as an example of verbal art. Or it can be something which can be related to even verbal art in the sense of something inventive related to science or something like that. Inspiration, like even a commencement speech. It does involve a design, it does involve an art, it does involve crafting. So you do, though, need some sources, not just one, sources, all right, to support your claim that indeed this is something that's highly valued. And those sources, then it will be interesting for you to explore what the reasons those sources give for that claim that it is indeed something which it is valued within the culture, within the community. Discuss and then illustrate with examples to show how language and metaphor, this is important, all right? So language, how does language relate to what has been produced as verbal art? Metaphor, something that we've been saying from the beginning is sort of there, that creativity in language, that inventiveness, that going outside of the box, so to speak, and how that has contributed to this positive evaluation of this selected example. So what you are selecting is something which is highly valued within the culture, and it can be, though, a wide range, but you need to identify those that agree and are going to sort of be your evidence to support your claim that this is indeed highly valued. And look at what has been discussed about this selected example that you are writing about. All right, so I want you to not just be sort of closed into your own idea and mind about what you're looking at. So you don't just pick up a song and say, oh, I like this song, I like it for this reason, it makes me feel good. No, that isn't the kind of thing we're looking for. First of all, there should be something that there's evidence to support it, that this is indeed highly valued. It's something which is considered verbal art. And at the same time, your focus is on how language and metaphor had contributed to this positive evaluation. All right, so we've said this now several times, and I hope it's clear, and I hope you've got your example, you're working on it, and look forward to reading it. Now, something that is more immediate, and that is your last continuous participation task, fourth one. And this will round out the continuous participation tasks that you've been given, each of them worth 5 points. So again, it counts as 20%, all four together. So this is the fourth one, 5 points, with reference to our discussion of examples from commencement speeches, motivation speeches. And we've looked at several examples: Steve Jobs, David Foster Wallace, Denzel Washington, we will look at today, Susan Rice, and identify and discuss some typical linguistic features that you find in those kind of motivation speeches. All right, so that's coming due on Friday, the 20th of November. So that is very immediate. So Denzel Washington, he's a popular commencement speaker. I just attended a commencement this past week at another university, and it was surprising to me. The speech that was given was so negative in its outlook. There was no real inspiration. It was the speaker seemed to be himself so depressed that the message was surprisingly quite negative. But that's not what you hear from Denzel Washington. We're going to take a look at a video that was made, which is really not just even one of his speeches. It's sort of a compilation of several of his speeches with this theme that is quite common to what he talks about at a graduation exercise. So let's take a listen. And what we're looking at, what we're thinking about is, well, how does he use language, and how does this sort of fit with our expectations of what goes into a commencement motivation kind of speech.
I found that nothing in life is worthwhile unless you take risks. Nothing. Nelson Mandela said, "There is no passion to be found playing small and settling for a life that's less than the one you're capable of living." Now, I'm sure in your experiences in school and applying to college and picking your major and deciding what you want to do with life, I'm sure people have told you to make sure you have something to fall back on. Make sure you got something to fall back on, honey. But I never understood that concept, having something to fall back on. If I'm going to fall, I don't want to fall back on anything. I want to fall forward. At least this way I'll see what I'm going to hit. Without consistency, you'll never finish. So do what you feel passionate about. Take chances. Don't be afraid to fail. There's an old IQ test, was 9 dots, and you had to draw 5 lines with a pencil within these 9 dots without lifting the pencil. The only way to do it was to go outside the box. Don't be afraid to think outside the box. Don't be afraid to fail big, to dream big. But remember, dreams without goals are just dreams. Reggie Jackson struck out 2,600 times in his career, the most in the history of baseball. But you don't hear about the strikeouts. People remember the home runs. Fall forward. Thomas Edison conducted 1,000 failed experiments. Did you know that? I didn't know that. Because the 1,001st was the light bulb. Fall forward. Every failed experiment is one step closer to success. You've got to take risks, and I'm sure you've probably heard that before, but I want to talk to you about why that's so important. You will fail at some point in your life. Accept it. You will lose. You will embarrass yourself. You will suck at something. There's no doubt about it. And I know that's probably not a traditional message for a graduation ceremony, but hey, I'm telling you, embrace it, because it's inevitable. In the acting business, you fail all the time. Early on in my career, I auditioned for a part in a Broadway musical. Perfect role for me, I thought, except for the fact that I can't sing. I didn't get the job. But here's the thing. I didn't quit. I didn't fall back. I walked out of there to prepare for the next audition, and the next audition, and the next audition. I prayed. I prayed, and I prayed. But I continued to fail, and fail, and fail. But it didn't matter, because you know what? There's an old saying, you hang around the barbershop long enough, sooner or later you're gonna get a haircut. So you will catch a break, and I did catch a break. Last year, I did a play called Fences on Broadway. But here's the kicker. It was at the Court Theater. It was at the same theater that I failed that first audition 30 years prior. The point is, every graduate here today has the training and the talent to succeed. But do you have the guts to fail? If you don't fail, you're not even trying. I'll say it again. If you don't fail, you're not even trying. To get something you never had, you have to do something you never did. So imagine you're on your deathbed, and standing around your deathbed are the ghosts representing your unfulfilled potential. The ghost of the ideas you never acted on. The ghost of the talents you didn't use. And they're standing around your bed, angry, disappointed, and upset. They say, we came to you because you could have brought us to life, they say. And now we have to go to the grave together. So I ask you today, how many ghosts are going to be around your bed when your time comes? Just got back from South Africa. It's a beautiful country, but there are places there with terrible poverty that need help. And Africa is just the tip of the iceberg. The Middle East needs your help. Japan needs your help. Alabama needs your help. Tennessee needs your help. Louisiana needs your help. Philadelphia needs your help. The world needs a lot, and we need it from you. We really do. We need it from you young people. I mean, I'm not speaking for the rest of us up here, but I know I'm getting a little grayer. We need it from you, the young people, because remember this. You got to get out there. You got to give it everything you got, whether it's your time, your talent, your prayers, or your treasures. What are you going to do with what you have? I'm not talking about how much you have. Some of you are business majors, some of you are theologians, nurses, sociologists, some of you have money, some of you have patience, some of you have kindness, some of you have love, some of you have the gift of long suffering, whatever it is, whatever your gift is. What are you going to do with what you have? All right, now here's my last point about failure. Sometimes it's the best way to figure out where you're going. Your life will never be a straight path. I began at Fordham University as a pre-med student. I took a course called cardiac morphogenesis. I couldn't read it, I couldn't say it, I sure couldn't pass it. So then I decided to go into pre-law, then journalism. And with no academic focus, my grades took off in their own direction. I was a 1.8 GPA. And the university very politely suggested that it might be better to take some time off. I was 20 years old. I was at my lowest point. And then one day, and I remember the exact day, March 27th, 1975, I was helping my mother in her beauty shop. My mother owned a beauty shop up in Mount Vernon. And there was this older woman who was considered one of the elders in the town. And I didn't know her personally, but I was looking in the mirror, and every time I looked at the mirror, I could see her behind me, and she was staring at me. She just kept looking at me. Every time I looked at her, she kept giving me these strange looks. So she finally took the dryer off her head and she said something I'll never forget. She said, young boy, I have a prophecy, a spiritual prophecy. She said, you are going to travel the world, millions of people. And in the years that followed, just as that woman prophesied, I have traveled the world and I have spoken to millions of people through my movies. Millions who up till this day couldn't see me, who up till this day I couldn't see while I was talking to them, and they couldn't see me, they could only see the movie. They couldn't see the real me. But I see you today, and I'm encouraged by what I see. And I'm strengthened by what I see. Because taking risk is not just about going for a job. It's also about knowing what you know and what you don't know. It's about being open to people and to ideas. The chances you take, the people you meet, the people you love, the faith that you have, that's what's going to define you. Never be discouraged. Never hold back. Give everything you got. And when you fall throughout life, remember this: fall forward.
Okay, go back and think about this speech now. What did you see in it that was sort of similar to what you've seen before with Steve Jobs, for example? Well, one of the things that you probably would have noticed was the story. There's a story. There's a personal story. That's what Steve Jobs' speech was. It was 3 of his lifetime stories. And you see the presence of story here. You see not just his own story, but you see other examples that are given as well. Well, that's part of what's being done here. But let's just take a look, and let's just go through the text itself to have an idea what was there about the language that is being used here. And so if I've broken it up into clauses, and that's what you see tagged here and so forth. So I found that's one clause, that nothing in life is worthwhile unless you take risks. There are 3 clauses in that first sentence. And the next is very short. It's a fragment of a sentence, nothing. Now, let's take a look at sort of the kinds of things that we see going on in this speech here. All right, there's a lot of first person and even also second person reference. It's a lot about I, but there's also quite a lot about you. There's a lot of imperatives. Let's just see on this, what we see now, we do see one imperative. We will see more. We do see short, abbreviated sentence fragments, short sentences or not even sentences, like nothing. There are some embedded clauses, well, those we would expect in a written kind, but it's also here. And we see more paratactic kind of expansions where he uses and. Let's keep going. Now, one of the things that we look at when we look at this, but I never understood, and I highlighted in green here, the verbs that are about thinking. I want, I figure, I see, I feel. It's I. We saw that already. We noticed that. There's also more verbs about what you think. There's more imperatives here. Take chances, don't be afraid. So we see similar things to what we've already been looking at already. Carry on. We do see some embedding here, but look at that. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. But remember. Now, those are what? Those are, it's repeating, but they're also imperatives. Don't be, don't be. So not only are you see the imperatives, you also see the kinds of short, also mental kind of references that are being used here. Further down, people remember the home runs. There's an example here, Reggie Jackson. Then his phrase, fall forward. So we see again these short sentences, yes, first person, second person, the imperatives that are repeated, we are illustrating with examples, and still the remember, mental processes. What are we looking at here? What we're looking at is those short sentences. No expansion, right? Because the 1001st was the light bulb. Every failed experiment is one step closer to success. You have these shorter sentences. There's no ands, there's no dependent clauses. It's simple. It's repeated, it's repetitive. You will, you will, you will. There are imperatives. Accept it. Fall forward. Again, we see these same features continually coming up. Again, the shorter sentences, no parataxis, no hypotaxis. Again, it's sort of I know, I thought, the mental. Here's the thing, again, the shorter sentences, the parataxis where there is, all right, the next edition, the next audition, and the next audition. That's just repetitive, but also paratactic. I prayed, I prayed, I prayed. So there's, again, these features that we keep seeing. It's repetitive. There are the examples that he's illustrating. There seem to be a lot of more mental. It's what one thinks. It's how one feels. And then this is his example. He doing the play on Broadway and coming back to where he had failed before as sort of, again, an example. And here we have a question that's asked. It's the only question that's asked in the whole speech. Continue to see, imagine you're on your deathbed. It's imperative, it's mental. Again, we see the parataxis, the shorter sentences. As I go through it, I begin to notice some things that keep happening. The shorter sentences, the repetition. Again, as we go through it, we're noticing the same features that we expected. Now, some of you are business majors. Some of you are theologians. Some of you have money. It's directed at you. It is repetitive. Again, we have these shorter sentences. I began at Fordham University as a pre-med student. I took a course. I couldn't read it. I couldn't say it. I sure couldn't pass it. So as we go through the speech then, all these examples lead us to sort of noticing these features continue to come up. Not so many questions, not so many embedded clauses, but where there is clause expansion, it tends to be more paratactic. We notice a lot of imperatives which are directed at his audience. It's very repetitive. He illustrates with examples. It is directed at how one thinks. It is how one feels, how one sees the world. And that does seem to be an aspect of what is being suggested here. Changing the way people feel, the way they look at what's going on in their lives. And making it short, abbreviated, sometimes even just sentence fragments. Well, that's the kind of features that we see keep coming up in these commencement speeches. They're motivation speeches. They're intended to relate to their audience. And the best way to do that is to come across in terms that are, as far as language, simple, straightforward, repetitive, and telling you in no uncertain terms what you should do, the imperatives. We see it here in this speech. Now, you might say, well, in a speech that inspires and motivates, like we've just been looking at, there's a lot about I. It's very first person. You have these speakers that are commencement speakers, and it does seem to be the person gets up there and speaks about from their own life experience. Now, is that motivational? Is that inspirational to be very first person and directed at that? Well, look at when we saw it with Trump, and we noticed it especially in his CIA speech, so many first person references. This is something that he's been very much criticized for. It seems to be that it's taken very differently than if you compare another speech that is like from Denzel Washington or Steve Jobs. What's the difference? What's the difference? In this discussion about his use of it, they said this: when it comes to Trump's rhetoric, what is perhaps most striking is the frequency with which he references himself. He says I, me, or my 850 times in these 7 speeches. 3.3% of his words are self-references. Remarkably high figure by the standards of any typical corpus. Well, not really, if you include commencement speeches in that category too. And in fact, in that study, 3.3% was high, but here, in fact, at the speech to CIA, it was first person singular, I, me, my references 14%. So what's the difference? What makes the difference? And if you go back and look at Trump's CIA speech, a lot of it is about mental and saying, well, that's not far different than what you just saw with Denzel Washington. What makes the difference? The context. The context is what makes a difference. In that context of a graduation ceremony where you invite a speaker to come and on the basis of their personal experience, share and in a way inspire and motivate, you expect the first person. It's what one does. What are you talking about? You're talking about what it is that's happened in your life that you can then share, and by doing so, hopefully motivate and inspire others to do so. It's directed at someone else. It is intended to motivate. So whereas Trump's speech was just about I, in a commencement speech, what would be the difference? There was also you. The imperatives are directed at you, the audience. There are references to you. So it's not just about I. It's not just about first person, but in the end, all that first person experience is directed at inspiring you. Well, that's certainly not there in Trump's speech. It's about I. There is no mention of you. There is no relating it to you. It's a speech. Look at the relationship in terms of also their role and their status. Denzel Washington is in that role speaking as a Hollywood celebrity, but in that context of being responsible to give a speech that will inspire the students. Here Trump was at the CIA headquarters, and it was supposed to be sort of motivating these people that worked at the CIA headquarters, but it was all about himself. The point I'm trying to make is you can't really count the number of first person references and on that basis judge the speech. You have to look at it in the context. And in the context, Trump was considered not to be behaving presidential. The way he was speaking did not fit with the expectations. When you consider the value of a speech, you have to consider its value within the context in which it's taking place. And there is always a context related to what we're speaking. And the context is what determines how people are going to respond, how they will value it, how they will accept it. Is there an acceptability? And that acceptability will go back to the context in which it takes place. When do you notice a lot of imperatives? Well, you notice a lot of them in these commencement speeches, these motivation speeches. You don't see a lot of imperatives outside of that. Well, except what did we give an example before. Online help documentation. Yeah, a lot of imperatives. So you have to look at a speech. It's not just, oh, there are a lot of imperatives. So there's a lot of first-person references. It also depends on how those features relate to the expectations of the audience in that context, how one speaks, how one responds, how one behaves. Now, I want to just, before next week, we will do more by way of review, but I just want you to start thinking about these key concepts. And so I'm going to go through and I'm going to list out these sort of key concepts that I'd like you to be paying attention to in your reviewing, in your study. And I would encourage you to, if there are questions you have about any of these, to raise them to me. Now, I just saw a note on the chat that someone asked, how can they get in touch with me? Well, you can do so by email, and my email is, I'll put it onto the chat again later, but I hope most of you should know it already, ctjjw at cityu.edu.hk. So you can get in touch with me and ask me. The person who is on chat just was asking my email so they can discuss the term paper. That's fine. Please do so. Encourage you to do so. There was another question on chat before I go further, and that was, is the maximum number of words 800? Yes, it should be. That is the maximum. It should not be more than 800 words. All right, continue. What metafunctions? This we've gone back. What is the purpose to which language is put? We identified three: ideational, the experiential, the logical, interpersonal, textual. We discussed some examples that related to these functions of language last week, and we'll keep mentioning some today and next week. For example, transitivity, how we experience and how we construe the world through identifying the process, the participant, the circumstances. Logical, whether it's paratactic or hypotactic. I keep mentioning those words, and just now when I was looking at Denzel Washington's speech, I was highlighting the parataxis and noticing that, and which is typical, as we said, in spoken kind of discourse. Mood and modality, whether you are giving information or receiving, whether you're asking a question or making a statement. Modality, the modal auxiliaries and what they illustrate about what is your attitude toward what you're saying and your attitude toward whom you're speaking. Theme, the choices of what you put first in each clause. Well, these are the wordings, and this is part of what we mean by grammar. When we say thinking about meaning means thinking grammatically, it's in terms of how language is realized. We've also talked about texture. What makes for a cohesive text? The patterning, the repetitive use of certain phrasings, and how you make for a coherent text, how the text is indicating the sort of the way in which you understand how the whole text is put together. Does it have a coherent structure? We just mentioned context of situation, and the context, we said, defines the register. We've noticed before the differences between speech and writing. We talked about grammatical metaphor, language of science, and in reference to both verbal science and verbal art, we've talked about de-automatization. Taking the automatic and the default and doing something that doesn't fit with the expected. We talked about religious discourse, political discourse, inspirational, motivational discourse. These are sort of, now just here, I've just given you sort of an overview of what I would consider key concepts that have been brought up and discussed throughout the semester. And so I hope that you would be paying attention to these. You remember there was a quote I gave you before, and this is from Professor Michael Halliday, who, as you should know, is the pioneer of systemic functional linguistics, the sort of model linguistic theoretical approach we've taken for looking at text. And what he said was this: what is important is that we should be able to use the same theory, method of linguistic analysis, the same grammatics, whatever kind of text or subtext we are trying to interpret, whether Tennyson or Darwin, Mother Goose or the Scientific American. In other words, it doesn't matter the text. It could just be a children's story, or it could be a highly valued example of verbal art. It could be a science journal or from a science magazine. Doesn't matter. The point being, you should be able to apply the same approach to being able to understand how the writer, the speaker, is making meaning. The opposite, what we don't want to be doing, is this, as he continues. Otherwise, if we simply approach each text with an ad hoc do-it-yourself kit of private commentary, we have no way of explaining their similarities and their differences, the aesthetic and functional values that differentiate one text from another or one voice from another within the frontiers of the same text. What's his point? His point is this, that if we just are going to talk about a text, sort of private commentary, this is my personal view, this is my assessment of the value and the what I consider to be either poor or good kind of use of language, or appropriate or inappropriate. Well, it has to do with more than just your own personal subjective point of view. How can we go outside of just that subjective view and arrive at a more perhaps objective way of being able to compare texts, noticing their similarities, their differences, their aesthetic. Aesthetic is how highly valued it is, its functional value, the purpose to which it's being put. The aesthetic functional values that differentiate one text from another. Texts differ from each other. We compare them. And we say that such and such stands out. This is an example of the use of language that inspires. This is art. Well, there you're pointing out the sort of how we value it in terms of its aesthetic qualities. Certainly, if we go back to online help documentation, it has zero, or we could say aesthetic qualities. It's not meant to be creative. It serves a purpose, though. It's functional. You cannot compare online help documentation with poetry. They serve a different purpose. They have a different motivation behind how they were written. That goes back to its function. So we are comparing texts, but how do we compare it? What are the differences then between online help documentation, for example, and a poem, or a motivation speech, or a speech that's meant to be given by a US president before Congress, or whatever kind of situation? You see, is there a way that we can go back to and look at how language is being used? Halliday says this: in real life, texts carry value. We need to explain that value in terms of what we know about semiosis, about meaning, about how meaning is made. So how do we explain the value that we discover in language? And we have to go back to look at how is language put together? What is language and how do we understand it? Well, that's going back to the grammar. And by the grammar, we mean its wording. This was a question that was asked before, and how much can we learn about a text from applying a systemic functional approach? It's a very good question. How do we answer it? And what do we learn from applying a systemic functional approach? And what do we mean a systemic functional approach? What do we mean? We mean going back to the meaning. What is meaning? Meaning is how you construe the world around you, reflect on it, what is your experience of the world? We call it the experiential. But how does that meaning then come through in terms of wording? And when we talk about wording, we're meaning it's not just the words, it's how those words are combined together. And when those words are put together and combined together, there you have grammar. And what is grammar? In the approach that we're taking, this systemic functional approach, we're saying that when you talk about the world and your reflection on the world, you're talking about it in terms of processes that are taking place. What's happening? What's going on? What are you feeling? These processes, these verbs, as we normally talk about them in terms of when we're talking about what's a process, it's a verb, as we've been saying. Then it's not just the process, it's also who initiated the process, who's affected by the process, what are the circumstances. This is what we said is what we call a system of choice, a system about what kind of process we use to talk about our experience, who we identify as who having initiated that process, who is affected by that process, and what are the circumstances. And we divided it up into different process types. We said there are processes that are related to doing. There are those that are mental, related to sensing, knowing, those that are related to saying, and so on. Now, an example that I gave, going back to the very beginning of the course, we were looking at comparing the speeches given by Donald Jung and Susan Rice. And these two speeches that were being given, there was a very different use of language. In the case of Donald Jung, we said when he talks about doing, who are the doers? Who are the initiators? Not people. Largely, primarily, it's things. But that fit with his whole way of looking at the world, as we said. But that's the point. We can compare their speeches in terms of here, the processes of doing and who's the doer. It fit with his way of looking at the world. As he puts it, as he quotes Emerson, things are in the saddle and ride mankind. We are not the masters of our fate. This is the way he sees the world. And that comes through his speech, not only when he says it explicitly like this, but when he's just talking, it's everything, all, and I won't say all, but primarily a lot of the doing, predominantly, is not being done by people. Compare that with Susan Rice. When we looked at doing, her verbs of doing, which made up 50% of her speech, 80% of that was done by I, you, we, people. We've been looking at her commencement speech, and we've noticed some things about it. Now, that is illustrating the point that I've been making. Yes, looking at language, looking at the processes, who initiates those processes, the circumstances. That does give us insight into what's being said, how it's being said. And not only that, it gives us insight into how that person sees the world. So language is important, but when we say language, what do we mean by language? We're saying, in the one hand, it's the processes that you choose and the participants that you identify and the circumstances in which it takes place. But beyond that, what else have we said? Well, the logical. taking a look at the logical use of language. Are there dependent clauses? How are the clauses combined? Let's take an example. In this example, this was from Obama's victory speech when he won the presidency the first time. And I gave you this example before. It's one big long sentence. Goes on and on and on. Effective or not effective? Well, there you have to look at something else. It's not just the length and the number of words and even the number of clauses. It's how it is logically combined together. And we notice that when you look at it, there is a logical structure to it. And what is that logical structure? It breaks down into almost like two levels, where each level identifies three pairs. And each of those three pairs, so that what we end up with is something that has even a rhythm. It enables him to speak in a way that it's not poetry, but it's something by which he is able to his voice gets louder. There is a crescendo. It almost takes on this a kind of music. And what gives it that sort of ability to have a rhythm and enable this sort of crescendo and this increase in tempo, it's this very symmetrical ordering of ideas, paired off, three at a time, three at each level, so that what we end up with something like this.
This is our chance to answer that call. This is our moment. This is our time to put our people back to work and open doors of opportunity for our kids, to restore prosperity and promote the cause of peace, to reclaim the American dream and reaffirm that fundamental truth that out of many we are one, that while we breathe, we hope, and where we are met with cynicism and doubt and those who tell us that we can't, we will respond with that timeless creed that sums up the spirit of a people. Yes, we can. Thank you. God bless you. And may God bless the United States of America.
So the logical structuring of this speech enabled that kind of way in which he could present it. It gave it its rhythm. It gave it its beat. It made it in a way so that he could present it, and it comes across as dynamic. It comes across, people praised this speech. Now, on the one hand, you'd say, well, but grammar-wise and sentence-wise, it is so complicated. No, the way it's structured in such a way that it gives it a kind of even simplicity. Because what you're doing is you're creating, through the grammar, you're creating structures that are balanced, they're symmetrical. Well, we've said before, Obama doesn't just write his own speeches. He has a speechwriter. His speechwriter is John Favreau. John Favreau is Obama's lead speechwriter. He gives an interesting sort of account of his experience with writing for Obama. He did this at an award acceptance speech that he gave, and this was at the university in Dublin. And at this speech, he talks about what it was that he feels sort of made Obama's speeches what we might call powerful, that gave it the power that it does. And we're going to look at this. We'll do this after we take a break. We'll first take a break, and then when we come back, we'll take a look at this. Okay, I think that it's about time to begin. And now, as I just mentioned, all right, so just to briefly give a bit context to this, we've just been looking at a speech that Obama gave, his victory speech, and it will be mentioned in this short video that I'm going to be showing you. We noticed, what do we notice about how the sort of the logical structuring of it contributed to the way he was able to present it in a way that comes across as being quite dynamic, all right? Now, Jon Favreau, okay, it's interesting to listen to him. He was accepting this award, and he is well known as Obama's main chief speechwriter. He's a young man. In fact, as he will explain, he was working for another politician earlier, and that politician, John Kerry, had run to become president again from the Democratic Party, and had failed, and that's where we sort of pick it up here in terms of the speech. He's speaking about his experience, yes, and his experience after having just left this one campaign that was had not succeeded. So let's listen, and I think you should find this interesting.
And then John Kerry lost, and I was crushed. I was 23 years old, but I became desperately cynical about politics and what it could do. I wanted to give it all up, and at that point I sort of had to because I was completely broke. So broke that when I drove home to Boston to move back in with my parents, I didn't have enough money to pay the last toll on the highway and had to speed right through the light. So that was rock bottom. Then a couple of weeks later, I received an email that changed my life. One of my bosses from the Kerry campaign was now a top aide to Senator Barack Obama and told me that he was looking to hire his very first speechwriter. My interview with Obama was surprisingly easy. We talked about our families and where we grew up. We talked about why we got into politics. But most of all, we didn't talk about the line that I took out of his convention speech because he didn't remember it was me. And at the end of the conversation, he said something I'll never forget. He said, "Well, I still don't think I need a speechwriter, but you seem nice enough, so let's give this a shot." And that's how I got the job. So, for 8 years, I had the chance to learn about writing from one of the very best. I can still remember the night I left the office to write my very first Obama speech. He yelled after me, "Favs, I know it's your first speech, and I know you're probably worried, and I know you're probably anxious, but know this, I'm a writer too. Sometimes the muse strikes, sometimes it doesn't. Things don't work out, come in tomorrow, and the two of us will work through it together." And that's how he was for 8 years. The president taught me more than I could have ever imagined about writing and storytelling. He taught me that crafting a simple, logical argument was more important than a snappy slogan or a catchy applause line. He taught me that shorter is always better, reminding me more than once that Abraham Lincoln fit the Gettysburg Address on the back of a napkin. He taught me the value of honesty and authenticity in writing. After delivering one of the most candid, heartfelt, politically risky speeches on race in America, he said to me, "I don't know if you can get elected president saying the things I did about race today. But I also know that I don't deserve to be president if I don't say the things that I believe." But I think the most important lesson that I learned from President Obama was about the power of storytelling to instill a sense of hope and why that's so important right now. We live in very cynical times. And that's partly because we are constantly being fed a steady stream of bad news. Scan the headlines on any given day, and you're bound to see story after story about a problem that can't be solved, a war that won't end, a disease we can't cure, a plane we can't find, a politician, a celebrity, or CEO who has lied or cheated or let us down in any number of ways. These stories are real, mostly, and the media keeps feeding us these headlines because we click on them. But as a consequence, we don't get enough good news. We don't hear as much about the hundreds of millions around the world who've been lifted from extreme poverty since the turn of the century. We don't hear about declining crime rates, or reduction in HIV infections, or the billions who've gained access to clean water and basic sanitation thanks to the generosity and commitment of the global community. It doesn't make the front pages when someone's life is saved because she finally could afford health insurance for the first time, or when a poor child escapes a bad neighborhood thanks to a dedicated teacher. The news will record every instance of a public figure's mistakes, but it cannot possibly capture the daily, countless examples of ordinary men and women who show kindness to a stranger, or forgiveness when wronged, or love without condition. And the news simply does not have the capacity to fully chronicle the slow, painful, and often frustrating pace that real peace and progress has always required. That's why we need storytelling that instills a sense of hope. And that's a job for the world's writers and poets, for its artists and dreamers, for its students and activists and youthful idealists of every age. The people of Ireland understand this better than most. Despite a long legacy of hardship and adversity, or more likely because of it, this small island has produced an incredible number of history's greatest storytellers who are today celebrated as some of your greatest heroes. Joyce, Beckett, Swift, Shaw, Wilde, Yeats, Haney, and of course those courageous Irish monks who rescued our civilization stories from the Dark Ages. Like these proud ancestors and so many other graduates of UCD, I know that many of you will go on to make an indelible impact on our world. And the best advice I can give you is this: whatever change you want to bring about, whatever career you want to pursue, whatever cause you want to champion, don't let anyone else's cynicism be your excuse for not trying. After that disappointing election in 2004, I can still remember the moment when I finally let go of that cynicism. It was the night of the 2008 election, but it wasn't when they called the race for Barack Obama. It was before that, as I was making final edits to the victory speech. The draft ended with a story we found about a woman from Atlanta, Georgia, named Ann Nixon Cooper, who had waited in line for 3 hours that day to cast her ballot. And what made the story so special was that Ann Nixon Cooper was 106 years old, born at a time when she wasn't allowed to vote for 2 reasons: because she was a woman and because she was African American. So we ended the speech by tracing all the seemingly impossible change she had witnessed over the course of her life: civil rights, voting rights, workers' rights, women's rights. Now, as they started calling the states on election night, someone pointed out to me that we should probably contact Ann Nixon Cooper and find out if she's okay with Barack Obama telling her story. So our campaign researchers dig up her number, and I give her a call. And I tell this frail, 106-year-old woman that a man who's about to become the first African-American president of the United States wanted to mention her in his victory speech. And she paused for a while, and then she said, "Will it be on television?" And I told her, yes, it would be on television. And then she thought about that for a while, and she asked me, "Which channel will it be on?" And I said, "All the channels." And then she said, "I'm so proud of him, and I'm so proud of us." And she started to cry. And at that point, so did I. And right at that moment, they called Ohio. The race was over. Everyone started cheering, and I hid under my desk so I could talk to Ann Nixon Cooper for a few more minutes. Seamus Haney once said, "If you have the words, there's always a chance that you'll find the way." On their own, hopeful stories and writing that inspires can't solve the world's problems or shield us from the hardship and heartache that's just part of life. But by reminding us of the progress we've made in the past and the possibilities that exist in the future, words can guide us, push us forward, and at the very least, encourage us to try. Thank you very much for this honor, and I'm very happy to take your questions.
That's the true genius of America, that America can change. Our union can be perfected. And what we've already achieved gives us hope for what we can and must achieve tomorrow. This election had many firsts. and many stories that will be told for generations, but one that's on my mind tonight is about a woman who cast her ballot in Atlanta. She is a lot like the millions of others who stood in line to make their voice heard in this election, except for one thing. Ann Nixon Cooper is 106 years old. She was born just a generation past slavery, a time when there were no cars on the road or planes in the sky, when someone like her couldn't vote for two reasons: because she was a woman and because of the color of her skin. And tonight, I think about all that she's seen throughout her century in America: the heartache and the hope, the struggle and the progress, the times we were told that we can't, and the people who pressed on with that American creed: yes, we can. At a time when women's voices were silenced and their hopes dismissed, she lived to see them stand up and speak out and reach for the ballot: yes, we can. When there was despair in the Dust Bowl and depression across the land, she saw a nation conquer fear itself with a New Deal, new jobs, a new sense of common purpose: yes, we can. When the bombs fell on our harbor and tyranny threatened the world, she was there to witness a generation rise to greatness and a democracy was saved: yes, we can. She was there for the buses in Montgomery, the hoses in Birmingham, a bridge in Selma, and a preacher from Atlanta who told the people that we shall overcome: yes, we can. A man touched down on the moon. A wall came down in Berlin. A world was connected by our own science and imagination. And this year, in this election, she touched her finger to a screen and cast her vote. Because after 106 years in America, through the best of times and the darkest of hours, she knows how America can change. Yes, we can. America, we have come so far. We have seen so much, but there's so much more to do. So tonight, let us ask ourselves, if our children should live to see the next century, if my daughters should be so lucky to live as long as Ann Nixon Cooper, what change will they see? What progress will we have made? This is our chance to answer that call. This is our moment. This is our time to put our people back to work and open doors of opportunity for our kids, to restore prosperity and promote the cause of peace, to reclaim the American dream and reaffirm that fundamental truth that out of many we are one, that while we breathe, we hope, and where we are met with cynicism and doubt and those who tell us that we can't, we will respond with that timeless creed that sums up the spirit of a people: yes, we can. Thank you. God bless you, and may God bless the United States of America.
It's so interesting to me to look at that speech in the context of the writer that worked with Obama on it. And if you look at that speech, we had just noticed about the way in which it was logically structured and gave it a kind of symmetry and so forth in terms of how it's presented. But there was something else. There were other things going on. And it wasn't just the yes, we can. That was quite dynamic too, repeating that, yes, we can. And you notice that the crowd started to enter into it so that it became a whole thing together, repeating that, yes, we can. But the whole thing then is contextualized, as Jon Favreau notes, in the context of this story, the story of this 106-year-old woman. So there are layers of, there's the story, there's the repetition, the phrase, yes, we can, the motto, repeat it, the logical structuring. There are many things that are going on in that speech that made it as effective as it was. You remember at the beginning, I think it's the first class in the lecture, I play a video, and the video is Langston Hughes, Let America Be America Again. Famous poet. And in this this video that I showed you at the first week, I said that we would come back to it. And I like to come back to it toward the end of the course. I mean, week 13, we will be doing review and so forth. But this lecture I consider to be more or less the last major lecture. And so I returned to that video. I'm going to play the video again. But what I want to do is I want you to notice something. This is the text of what you see in the video. It's honestly a much shorter version of the whole poem by Langston Hughes. We're going to look at the video itself that takes out and extracts out part of that poem that Langston Hughes wrote. And then we're going to take a look at the whole poem. What I want you to be sort of thinking about is what was cut out? Why was it cut out? Why is it only this part that was put into that video? And what message were they conveying that was perhaps different than the whole poem that was being expressed by Langston Hughes? But let's first of all look at that video that should remind you of how we began in the course.
Let America be America again.
Let it be the dream it used to be. America. Never was America to me.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its dream.
Let America be the dream the dreamers dreamed.
We are talking about a society in which there will be no roles other than those chosen or those earned.
Let it be the great strong land of love.
Where never kings connive nor tyrants scheme. That any man be crushed by one above.
It never was America to me. Oh, let my land be a land where liberty is crowned with no false patriotic wreath.
You cannot oppress the people who are not afraid anymore.
But opportunity is real and life is free.
The question always is, what kind of a world do we want to be a part of?
Equality is in the air we breathe.
So I would like to say that we're one today. Let us be one in the future. Power to all of us.
There's never been equality for me, nor freedom in this homeland of the free.
Donald J. Trump is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States.
Who said the free?
When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. But we have some bad hombres here, and we're going to get them out.
There should be a lot of systems beyond
This Freedom Restoration Act was signed into law last week.
You can see there was blood coming out of her eyes. Blood coming out of her.
I don't know what I said. I'd like to punch him in the face, I'll tell you. Here's a brief summary of my executive orders. New vetting to keep terrorists out of the United States, a border wall, and a great rebuilding of the armed services of the United States.
For all the dreams we've dreamed and all the hopes we've held,
The millions who have nothing for our pay except the dream.
that's almost dead.
Today.
We know the battle ahead will be long. But always remember that no matter what obstacles stand in our way, nothing can stand in the way of the power of millions of voices calling for change.
We are always going to fight for this country. We will not stand for this.
Yes, we can.
Out of the wreck and ruin of our gangster death,
The rape and rot of graft and stealth and lies,
we the people must redeem.
If you dare to struggle, you dare to win. If you dare not to struggle, then goddamn it, you don't deserve to win.
and make
America
No, but there's hope for a better world.
again.
Why don't you live for the people? Why don't you struggle for the people? Why don't you die for the people?
All right, now, what I want you to do is I want you to take a look at this, the video you just saw. Now, there are so many layers, again, to what was going on in that. It's the images that you see. It's the voiceovers of people speaking. There's so many things that are going on, in addition to the words from this poem, Let America Be America Again. What I've highlighted here in red is the words that were in that video that you just saw. But look as you do, as we go through it and as you listen to it, and notice what was not in that video.
Let America Be America Again by Langston Hughes. Let America be America again. Let it be the dream it used to be. Let it be the pioneer on the plain seeking a home where he himself is free. America was never America to me. Let America be the dream the dreamers dreamed. Let it be that great, strong land of love where never kings connive nor tyrants scheme, that any man be crushed by one above. It was never America to me. Oh, let my land be a land where liberty is crowned with no false patriotic wreath, but opportunity is real and life is free, equality in the air we breathe. There's never been equality for me, nor freedom in this homeland of the free. Say, who are you that mumbles in the dark? And who are you that draws your veil across the stars? I am the poor, white, fooled and pushed apart. I am the Negro bearing slavery scars. I am the red man driven from the land. I am the immigrant clutching the hope I seek and finding only the same old stupid plan of dog eat dog, of mighty crush the weak. I am the young man full of strength and hope, tangled in that ancient endless chain of profit, power, gain, of grab the land, of grab the gold, of grab the ways of satisfying need, of work the men, of take the pay, of owning everything for one's own greed. I am the farmer, bondsman to the soil. I am the worker, sold to the machine. I am the Negro, servant to you all. I am the people, humble, hungry, mean, hungry yet today, despite the dream, beaten yet today. Oh, pioneers, I am the man who never got ahead. I am the poorest worker bartered through the years yet. I am the one who dreamt our basic dream in the old world while still a serf of kings, who dreamt a dream so strong, so brave, so true, that even yet its mighty daring sings in every brick and stone, in every furrow turn that's made America the land it has become. Oh, I am the man who sailed those early seas in search of what I meant to be my home. For I am the one who left dark Ireland's shore and Poland's plain and England's grassy lay, and torn from black Africa's strand to build a homeland of the free. The free? Who said the free? Not me. Surely not me. The millions on relief today, the millions shot down when we strike, the millions who have nothing for our pay, for all the dreams we've dreamed and all the songs we've sung and all the hopes we've held and all the flags we've hung, the millions who have nothing for our pay except the dream that's almost dead today. Oh, let America be America again, the land that never has yet been and yet must be the land where every man is free, the land that's mine, the poor man's, Indians, Negroes, me, who made America, whose sweat and blood, whose faith and pain, whose hand at the foundry, whose plow in the rain must bring back our mighty dream again. Sure, call me any ugly name you choose. The steel of freedom does not stain from those who live like leeches on people's lives. We must take back our land again. America, oh yes, I say it plain. America was never America to me. And yet I swear this oath. America will be. Out of the rake and ruin of our gangster death, the rape and rot of graft, of stealth and lies, we, the people, must redeem the land, the mines, the plants, the rivers, the mountains, and the endless plain. All the stretch of these great green states, and make America again.
Rather different, right? In its poetic form, rather than as extracted out and so forth. What do you find, though, is sort of left out from this speech? Well, the one thing that I felt was the first person, the poet. The poet's voice is very present here. I am, I am. This is repeated, and it's very much in the first person. You feel the sense of the poet, but that is sort of, in a way, missing from the video that's produced, which is trying to make more or less a political statement. This, yes, of course, is a political statement too, but said in a very first person way. I wonder, what's your impression? What do you feel? Which did you prefer, the video or the poem? What's your response? How would you respond to that? I'll ask those that are here if you want to. Would you like to? What's your impression? A bit louder, please.
The video adds too many clauses, and I think it's too complicated, and the meaning the point want to express is very concise and very hopeful, and he do not talk much about real life and the real event. So it's very ideal. So that in the aesthetic value is better.
So the video, you felt added value to it. You felt made it more concrete in the sense that putting it within, but also in a way very much making it contemporary, right?
Yeah.
Because when you see the poem itself, you might say it's a bit dated in the sense of the references that are being made and so forth, which would be a vocabulary that's there that may not be there. So in a way, they're trying to, yes, take out those. But also what struck me, though, is the fact that I in listening to the poem, I felt I'm hearing the poet's voice. But what I felt when I watched the video is not really hearing a poet's voice as much as hearing sort of mottos that were being taken out and being sort of put across to me as messages. And the messages are, and I don't know if those of you who can hear me from that are not present and so forth online, but it just to me it sort of I felt much more moved by the poem than I did from the video. That was my feeling. And I felt it was, the point that I felt was that what was, yes, in a bit dated and was true for him, but yet still remains true for many today. And so there can be sort of an ability to identify with that poet's voice. There are other.
Like you say, I think in a video, the models are falsely used. I think it's too personal to Trump, you know.
I'm going to give you the microphone.
Oh,
Don't be put off by. I should have done that before. It just occurred to me, but I think that they hear you.
Okay, I just like you said, I think the models that they take from this poem in our video is falsely used. I think it's too personal to Trump, too personal to the temporary time. I think it's just a thing, a temporary thing of politics. Yeah, I think, and I sure this poem impresses me the most because I think it can stand no matter how long the time passes. Right. It still stands.
But the video itself will also be very dated. I mean, the fact that it has all the references to Trump and so forth are also messages that were true at that point, which will probably be sort of.
But of course, in different way, I guess.
Sorry.
In different way, they're gonna be dated in different way, right? What do you think? Of course, in the
because I don't feel people will watch that video probably a few years from now. The Langston Hughes poem continues to make meaning and be meaningful because there is an art in the words, I feel, and in the language that is in some ways lost when it's put into the context of the video. Anton, you have any thoughts?
I agree with them pretty much. I mean, I think that it's...
Your voice is loud, and I don't know if this picks up anything or not.
One of the things that I think that it's sort of good to remember is that while many people may dislike the politics of Trump, and if we look back at history, there are the sort of the great monsters. You've got Hitler, you've got Stalin. But I spent some time in Russia 25 years ago and had the privilege of talking to the ex-wife of one of Stalin's personal guards, one of Stalin's personal protectors. And talking to her in the mid-90s, she was remembered very vividly and wonderfully the time of Stalin. It was a great time for Russia. It was a great time for the Soviet Union. And there was order, there was greatly increasing prosperity. And so there are people who remember things in different ways. And so I think that if you look at the most recent election, that people are going to remember Trump's time in a very different way if they are on the other side. Like there are people that would sort of look at that video and think that it's completely false and it's sort of an irresponsible presentation of reality. So I think they're sort of different in a way. They're different, like through, I mean, people repurpose art and create new art. And so I think that, I don't know, like I think they're both useful and they're both valid. And I mean, obviously not obviously, but I personally also preferred the full version of the poem. but I mean, I think that there are sort of things that can also be useful for looking at a particular time in history. Like, I think that the 4 years of Trump presidency, which that first video was clearly a sort of reaction against. Like, we can look at these times later on and sort of try and understand how we got into that position and how the sort of political feelings that gave rise to that flow through. And also look at the use of language and the use of the context of video, how you have a sort of, what's it called, a potpourri of images and sound which can come in, and repurposing of a beautiful old poem. So I think, I don't know, basically I think there's a lot to get. I mean, personally, I was touched more by the poem, but I think that there's a lot of layers to any, to both of them.
Yeah. Thank you. Again, I'd like to know if those of you that are online watching, could you hear what was being said by those that are here in the classroom? Could you hear it? If you could just reply by chat. Slightly, yes. Okay, that's good. I'm glad to hear. In a way, that's the one thing I miss very much in the way that we conduct the teaching nowadays. It's nice to be able to interact with you who are listening and watching, and to understand how you are responding to these examples of language as art, invention, or inspiration. But what impressed me with the poem, it's just just in the spoken word, without the addition of music, without the addition of videos, without any other kind of media, it has a power. It makes that voice carry a certain power. And that is what I'd like you to sort of take away from this, if nothing else, and that is that language itself has a power. Doesn't have to be even combined with anything else, videos or music or whatever. It by itself, it is able to be very powerful in terms of the message that it is being put across. It comes through. I mean, like you see on the screen, I am the farmer, I am the worker. It has that rhythm, it has that, that comes through in this sort of this poetic voice. So there's a power in language that in many ways I feel somewhat transcends our use of, outside of the use of, for example, the poetic voice and language. In a way, I take a different view. I think in some respects, it's sort of, yes, it entertains, it maybe draws our attention, but it doesn't sort of have that sort of ability. The video I'm talking about, the video itself doesn't have the ability to really speak to me in terms of the words that really cause me to respond to it and feel it. And that's what I sort of feel comes across here. It reminds me of the America's Got Talent and the spoken word performer is Brandon Leak, and the response that people had to it. It was just words, just spoken, but still it has a power. There's a power in the poetic voice. And if any of you have seen my book, Understanding Verbal Art, you know I've been very impressed with. And earlier when we talked about the poetry, we talked about the poetry of Edwin Tumbu, this Singaporean poet. Edwin Tumbu, and just to give you a reminder, he is considered father of English language poetry in Singapore. I knew him from the time when I taught at the National University of Singapore back in the 80s, and he was the dean and the head of the department. He wrote a poem. The poem was Language as Power. And he wrote it for two people. Two friends of his. One Larry Smith and the other Braj Kachru. And both of them, Larry Smith and Braj Kachru, were very significant in what's been called world Englishes, identifying the varieties of language, varieties of English that are spoken throughout the world. Braj Kachru, his name is more or less synonymous with the idea of world Englishes. And he talks about there being an inner circle. He sort of puts it in categories. We have an inner circle, which is sort of the native speaker varieties. An outer circle where you have sort of language, English as a second language, India, Singapore, and the expanding circle where English is being used as very often maybe a foreign language, not just a second language. The point he was making was that when you consider the people that speak English worldwide, they very vastly outnumber those in the inner circle. And who sort of has control of the language? Well, this was something that Braj Kachru questioned, and he felt that it's not as though those in the outer circle need to rely on, and the native speaker varieties of the inner circle must be sort of decide what is the standard of English. But language in its cultural setting, in its new cultural settings, will change. And this is sort of this expanding circle that he sees. And he was very much an advocate of the idea that it's not just English of the US or English of the UK, it's English worldwide. And the language will adapt and it will change and it will fit the culture and the circumstances within which it is being used. Well, this is the idea put forward by Braj Kachru and another collaborator with him, Larry Smith. And these are the two people that Edwin was writing this poem for. So let me just give you some background to the poem. The poem, Language as Power, was written for two of Edwin Talbot's closest friends, Professor Braj Kachru and Professor Larry Smith. Both are well known for their pioneering scholarship in the study of non-native varieties of English, for their role in founding the International Association of World Englishes. The poem itself is a composition in two movements. The first movement celebrates the power of the word. The second movement focuses on the ramifications of the spread of English worldwide, the phenomenon known as world Englishes. The poet will refer to something which he calls Kachru circles, and that's what we just saw. And this is in the fourth stanza. This is alluding to Braj Kachru's three concentric circles of English, the inner, outer, expanding circles. This serves as a means for classifying native and non-native varieties of English. The poet also addresses the concerns raised by Larry Smith concerning the intercultural intelligibility, interpretability, and comprehensibility known as the Smith Triad. For both of them, there were three circles, and the Smith Triad were three aspects of language. The number three, you'll notice, comes through quite significantly. So here is the poem. I will read it to you. You might remember me telling you this story. This was that when I left Singapore, and my last lecture, I taught a lecture on sociolinguistics, and I asked Professor Talbot, Edwin, to come and read this poem, Language as Power. And you might remember the story I told about how I went and escorted him to the lecture theater. And on the way, I said to him, if you don't mind, after you have read the poem, would you please interpret the poem? And you might remember what his response was. You never ask the poet to interpret his own poem. And he said it very sternly. And it's a lesson that I learned. And we've talked about it before when we talked about the poem, A Poet Reading, that the idea being that a poem lives with every person who reads it and understands it and responds to it and takes away some meaning from it. If the poet interprets it, that's it. It more or less kills the poem in the sense that there is no other meaning to discover outside of what the poet has already said. But if the poet doesn't interpret it for us, it means whatever it means to you and me as we read it, as we listen to it. I don't know if you can see sort of the direction I'm moving in this last lecture. It's the power of language. Language is power. It just in itself, the pure language spoken can have such an impact, can have a power. And there's an aspect of which Edwin is speaking about this here as well. Language is power. So let me read the poem for you. The beginning was the Word, God. As polymath distributed syllables to perfect seasons in the land, our sense of edifice of stars, Om, Alpha, the limitless, Mahala Om, Grace's affirmed humble call to prayer, prophecy, perpetual whisper, impelling bud to rose, the adjectival poise of mountain, sea, and plain. The word traveled, tilted, soared, in songs, unfolding fragrances, arched across double rainbows, multiplied lush humming islands, entered the hot blood of Halamamo, the scaling orioles of the sun, the dedicating frangipani as it fell, riding glistening surfaces of wind, voices shot from conjugating hearts. Each seamless chant will ever bind Rama Sita, Adam Eve, Gakonya Mumbai, whose redeeming myths still numinate, render precise the march of history. The start of speech communities, natal, semantic loads, empires, Kachru circles. Vigilant certainty against forked tongue, and as assertive tribes insinuate authority, invent command, extend language into power, neo-power into language, the play of words. Then the word begot Tefl, Tessel, and TG, ways of discourse, metafiction, streams of specialists whose disciples hypothesized, quarreled, exported heresies, then some perceived avatars, a third eye, ancestral voices in the twilight of the creek, the serpent, and the rope, felt how the hills are distant as they watch the glow behind shifty verbs. Wordsworth in the tropics, daffodils mutate, out of the parley in the tense of fresh vocabulary, equal, reconciling Englishes, dismantle white umbras through synonyms, translating psyches, achieving metaphors, defining room for mutual, fresh realities. A calculus for fellowship of language as power, as making, as release. The number 3 comes through in this poem in quite a bit, and we'll take a look at that in other aspects of the poem. There's a lot that's going on in that poem, and much of it is you need perhaps some other knowledge and some other experience. Remember Edwin's line from A Poet Reading, see her as you will, as you can. Some of these references you won't know, and you'd miss what it was that he was trying to say. But that is part of the whole poem. There is more here than perhaps what one can even completely understand of what's being said. But we'll try to take a look at it, try to take a look and understand something about what was being said and what was being communicated through this poem. And what is the point about language as power? And I will share with you my sort of interpretation, my analysis of looking at this poem. And we'll do that when we come back from the break. And I see it's about time to take a break, so let's do so. I see you back at the top of the hour. Raj Khajru talked about 3 concentric circles. 3 comes through in the poem, and so in a way it's sort of tailored to fit to sort of this idea of things in threes. And you notice it when you can see on the screen the alliteration: travel, tilted, sword, songs, unfolding fragrances. 3 sort of instances of alliteration. 3 verbs, which are ing: humming islands, scaling orioles, dedicating frangipani as it fell. Ramasita, Adam, Eve, Kakonya Mumbi. So he keeps repeating this idea of things in threes. Insinuate authority, invent command, extend language into power. TEFL, teaching English as a foreign language. TESOL, teaching English to speakers of other languages. TG, a reference to transformational grammar. These are all references to linguistic ideas. Ways of discourse, metafiction, streams of specialists. Hypothesized, quarreled, exported heresies. The creek, the serpent, the rope. Everything is in threes. He talks about 3 flowers. 3 flowers that have some association. Rose, associated with England. Frangipani, Hawaiian flower, tropical areas. The daffodil, suggested perhaps with UK and so forth. Continuing, translating psyches, achieving metaphors, and then finally the last line: as power, as making, as release. So yeah, there's one technique, and that is that the poet keeps repeating things in threes. Well, that fits sort of the idea of Khajru circles, the Larry Smith's idea of a Smith triad, and so forth. Now, there's another association, though, that's quite interesting. And this is something which Edwin had done previously in a poet reading. Remember there I mentioned how he sort of modeled it after another poet's use of language and so forth in their poem. And in this case, it's Coleridge's. There is sort of a reference to an association modeled in a way after a poem by Samuel T. Coleridge. It's a very well-known poem, Kubla Khan, or A Vision in a Dream, a Fragment. That's the title. It's a famous poem that exists in the English language. And Samuel Coleridge, in that poem, Kubla Khan, or A Vision in a Dream, a Fragment, has these lines: 5 miles meandering with a slazy motion through wood and dale, the sacred river ran, then reached the caverns measureless to man, and sank in tumult to a lifeless ocean. And mid this tumult Kubla heard from far ancestral voices prophesying war. So the reference then in the poem to ancestral voices, that begins to suggest perhaps an association between Edwin's poem and Coleridge's Kubla Khan. There's another thing, there's more to it than that though, and that is that both Coleridge's poem and Tambu's can be divided into 2 movements. Think of it like a symphony. And they have 2 movements here. One is, it starts the beginning, and the second movement begins the start. You can see it sort of balances out. We have sort of 3 sort of stanzas on one movement and 3 stanzas in the other. The one begins the beginning, the other begins the start. 2 movements, very similar to Coleridge's Kubla Khan, also two movements. The first movement ends with this phrasing, render precise the march of history. The second movement, a calculus for fellowship of language as power, as making, as release. Those two movements reflect two main ideas that are true of Edwin Tumbu. And this is from Rajiv Patki, National University of Singapore, writing about Edwin's poetry. He says this, Tumbu's variation on the lyric mode are held together by an integrated vision focused on two themes. The interpenetration of the personal by the historical imagination, and the role of friendship in the private and the public realms. Myth, symbol, allusion, fable, and anecdote all are harmonized by the overarching consistency of these twin concerns. And what were they? The history. The interpenetration of the personal by the historical. The role of friendship in the private and the public realms. You remember, gods can die, the whole notion of what does it mean to be a friend, both private and the public domain. So these two themes, if we ask ourselves, who is the poet writing for? Yes, he's writing for Larry and for Braj, but on the other hand, he's also expressing two sort of themes that are common in his poetry. The one related to history, the other related to friendship, fellowship. Why a calculus? There's one question that I had for Edwin was, why a calculus for fellowship of language? And he explains his choice of word, calculus for fellowship of language, like this. When it comes to world Englishes, it is not just a case of multiplication, as though one were producing photocopies. A simple arithmetic is inadequate to account for the evolved and pluralistic nature of the many existing varieties of English worldwide. Instead, what is needed is a calculus for fellowship of language. It's not just a simple reduplication of the language. It's something much more complicated than that. There's some very interesting aspects of the poem that relate to its technique. Most of the poem is in trimeter or tetrameter, meaning sort of 3 beats or 4 beats, but there are 2 lines, only 2 lines, which are in pentameter, meaning that you have 5 beats. 5 sort of where you have a stress, 5 stresses. And it comes very interestingly in the 5th line. So you have 5 sort of measures, all right? 5 sort of where you have a stress and an unstressed. You have 5 in the first stanza, in the 5th line, and in the 5th stanza, in the 5th line, in stanza 5, also has this pentameter. So again, the poet is using language in a way that reflects the fact of how deliberate his use of language is. It's, as he puts it, it's the technique. Yes, that's part of it. The technique is just, in a way, draws out the craft, draws out the art in terms of the poetry. So again, first stanza, fifth line. The 5th stanza, again, the 5th line, both of them in pentameter, the only 2 lines in the whole poem. In the middle of each of these 2 movements, in the 2nd stanza and the 5th stanza, in the middle of each of them is a triplet. Now, this is the same as in Kubla Khan. In Coleridge's Kubla Khan, there is a triad, there's a triplet in the middle of the middle section of each movement. Again, in many ways, he's using the same sort of kind of way of the technique that you notice in Coleridge's Kubla Khan. For example, arched, multiplied, entered. These three lines begin with a verb in the past tense. Noticeably, you have this triplet. In the second movement, then you have this line in the middle. Then some perceived avatars a third eye. Now, you might say, where is the triplet there? How come then some perceived avatars a third eye? One must go back to look at a bit of Indian culture to understand it. The incarnations of Vishnu, the middle deity in the Hindu Trinity, are called avatars. That's in the middle. Now that relates then to this whole idea of related to the kind of Hindu Indian culture. So there is this idea of then some perceived, likely a reference to Brahma, 4 heads said to represent the manifestation of the consciousness of mind, intellect, ego, conditioned consciousness. Vishnu in the middle between Brahma and Shiva. Vishnu represents the maintenance of balance in the universe through the support of physical and spiritual laws. Shiva, the destroyer, with that third eye. Although that line then does break down into those 3 deities. Om, you remember his reference to Om, Mahala Om. Now what in Sanskrit, this symbol has a meaning, Om. What does it represent? Again, you'll notice that there are 3 curves in Om. The upper curve, deep sleep, the lower curve, waking state, and the right side curve, which lies between the deep sleep and the waking state, signifies the dream state. The rest of the word itself and the character, you have the dot. That signifies the absolute. The semicircle symbolizes Maya, separates the dot from the other 3 curves. It relates to what? And again, we come back to Kubla Khan, Samuel Coleridge's Kubla Khan. There's a line in it, the concluding lines, in fact, of Kubla Khan read like this: weave a circle round him thrice. Again, you can see the obvious reference to Cottrell's 3 circles of English. And close your eyes with holy dread, for he on honeydew hath fed and drunk the milk of paradise. This vision in a dream leading ultimately to paradise, that sort of represented what we see in the whole idea of Om. It resembles this Hindu notion of enlightenment, the third eye, the dot, the symbol for Om. Reinvigorating by the poet's craft and his own history, this literature becomes the means for, as he puts it, translating psyches, achieving metaphors, defining room for mutual, fresh realities. Translating psyches, achieving metaphors, defining room for mutual, fresh realities. That sums up really well what the poet is saying about how language works. Translating the ways we think, achieving metaphors, defining room, making space for mutual, shared, fresh realities. That line really sums up in a really beautiful way the idea of what the poet is saying about language itself. He goes on to say this. He says, there is no alien mythology in the poet's pluralistic world. Only mythologies waiting to be poems waiting for release. Why does he make this point about alien mythology? As though there is a way of thinking about the world, there's a mythology that is alien. He's saying there is no alien mythology in this sort of pluralistic world he describes. And in this, he is responding to V.S. Naipaul. V.S. Naipaul made this comment: the language was ours to use as we pleased. The literature that came with it was therefore a peculiar authority. But this literature was like an alien mythology. There was, for instance, Wordsworth's notorious poem about the daffodil, a pretty little flower, no doubt, but we had never seen it. Could the poem have any meaning for us? What Edwin was saying was that it's not, he doesn't accept this idea of there being an alien mythology. It is just simply, as he puts it, an alien mythology it is waiting for release. It is waiting to be understood. I just want to make some points as we go through this in terms of the first movement, the first stanza. The beginning was the word, God. His polymath distributed syllables to perfect seasons in the land. Our sense of edifice, of stars. Om, Alpha, the limitless, Mahala Om. Grace's affirmed humble call to prayer, prophecy, perpetual whisper. Impelling bud to rose, the adjectival poise of mountain, sea, and plain. This goes back to creation. Stanza 1. It's the first line, the beginning was the word. If you are familiar with the Gospel of John and the first chapter and the first verse, in the beginning was the word, God. Well, he's sort of playing on those words here in the first line. So this stanza records how God, as polymath distributed syllables to perfect seasons in the land, and he describes this adjectival poise of mountain, sea, and plain. Power is evident in the creation's perfect poise. There's power in what one sees in creation. Stanza 2, the word. Again, notice that it is capitalized, the word. Again, you go back to the Gospel of John in the New Testament, the word made flesh, the incarnation of God. The word traveled, tilted, soared in songs, unfolding fragrances, arched across double rainbows, multiplied lush humming islands, entered the hot blood of Halumamau, the scaling orioles of the sun, the dedicating frangipani as it fell. In this stanza, the poet awakens more than our sense of edifice. It's not just the existence of creation, but he awakens more than this with this mention of songs, unfolding fragrances, double rainbows, lush humming islands. We sense motion, travel, tilted, soared. We see the orioles ascending, scaling orioles. Enjoy with gradually heightened appreciation, music, fragrance, intermingled songs, unfolding fragrances. Behold with a sense of wonder, double rainbows, and feel the excitement and the foreboding on entering the hot blood of Halumamau. The reader is experiencing the beauty, the grandeur of creation. Stanza 3, still movement 1. Notice it has all been about the creation, about incarnation of God. It is this miracle, this power. Riding glistening surfaces of wind, voices shot from conjugating hearts. Each seamless chant will ever bind. Rama, Sita, Adam, Eve, Gakonyu Mumbi, whose redeeming myths still numinate, render precise the march of history. There is a sense of humanity coming together, reinforced in the third stanza by the reference to conjugating hearts. Each seamless chant will ever bind. There is this coming together, this unity. And he uses the word numinate. Comes from, imparts a sense of the spiritual, but also of the awe, the reverence that's associated with this root element, numen. It's a spiritual force. It's a spiritual power. Well, that's, the first movement is all about a grandeur, a power, a wonder. Then we get to movement 2. And this power and this wonder of the word and of the creation of power and God is suddenly, there's a diminishing. The start of speech communities, natal semantic loads, empires, Kotru circles, vigilant certainty against forked tongue, as assertive tribes insinuate authority, invent command, extend language into power, neo-power into language, the play of words. It is as though language is taken over, and the wonder of what was there to begin with is now turned into a neo-power, not real power. As I say here, the power and the wonder of the word, which have been so forcefully projected over the first three stanzas, is portrayed here in an obviously diminishing capacity. Along with the historic beginnings of speech communities, rise of empires, subsequent development of Kotru circles, have come the stirrings of tribal assertiveness, linguistic chauvinism. The power of word is turned on its head. It becomes neo-power, not real power. It becomes just simply the play of words. Stanza 5, and the word begot tefel, tessel, tg, ways of discourse, metafiction, streams of specialists whose disciples hypothesized, quarreled, exported heresies, and some perceived avatars, a third eye, ancestral voices in the twilight of the creek, the serpent and the rope, felt how the hills are distant as they watch the glow behind shifty verbs. In place of that seamless chant which will ever bind, there is now quarreling, there is mistrust, there are shifty verbs. Wordsworth in the tropics, daffodils mutate. Out of the parley in the tense, a fresh vocabulary, equal, reconciling Englishes, dismantle white umbras through synonyms, translating psyches, achieving metaphors, defining room for mutual fresh realities, a calculus for fellowship of languages, power is making release. This quarreling gives way to the parley in the tense, leading to a fresh vocabulary, equal, reconciling Englishes. There are repeated references to freshness, fresh vocabulary, fresh realities. And these contrast with the agedness alluded in the previous stanza, ancestral voices in the twilight. Every count noun in this stanza is in the plural form, tropics, daffodils, tense, Englishes, umbras, synonyms, psyches, metaphors, realities. The power of language lies in its ability to adapt. Daffodils mutate and accommodate a plurality of perspectives, defining room for mutual, fresh realities. I began with this question: how much can we learn about a text from applying a systemic functional approach? Well, analyzing the language can get us only really part of the way. Yes, it does give us an insight into how language works, but it never really is going to give us the full picture. There's always more to it. All that we really get of it is some of it. And that's the power of language. Power of language is not something you can really, we can find the triplets and we can find where you have various techniques that are used, but it will never give you the full meaning. That eludes us. That is something that we are not able to fully grasp. And that in itself is what we would expect in terms of what is the power of language. And with that thought,
I, of course, hope that linguistics will continue to throw light on language. I hope it will, how shall I say, maintain at least the basic principles that I have always tried to live with. Language as a basic human resource, as something that has potentially immense power, which is hidden very often, partly because people are genuinely not aware of how much they are, in fact, depending on it. I used to say this to students sometimes. Here is a set of tasks imagine how much more difficult would they be if you had no language with which to engage with them.
I've mentioned this lecture that Halliday gave before. It's a very impressive example of how what one is saying, the power of words, the power of what it is we're saying can make such a difference. You see, it's not just the language itself, it's what you are saying. It's the thought, it's the knowledge, it's the insight behind the words that are being used. And I think, as you will see in this short bit from the lecture itself, it reflects on how language is being used and how language is changing.
I mean, even within one language, we can see kind of new patterns in the integration of the meta functions, right? Because meanings are now often packaged as a succession of bite-sized chunks to accommodate the reduced space on a small screen and perhaps the reduced attention span of today's interactions. Now, this means it's a curious consequence of this. It means that both interpersonal and textual meanings take on a new prominence, although for different reasons. The textual in integrating these various semiotic strands, with the interesting consequence that it becomes less explicit in the text. You know, it's rather like the subtitles in a foreign language movie, sort of thing. The interpersonal, on the other hand, becomes more explicit as the exchange of meaning becomes increasingly individualized and personalized. Just for example, on our television screens of Parliament in Canberra, we are never shown parliamentary debates, only the ranting and swapping of abuses that are thought to make good television. So the whole of politics in that way is simply personalized and individuated. Now here, of course, you can hear the interpersonal component intruding into my own text, because it is clear that I don't like to find so much of meaning reduced to a series of bite-sized chunks. And I don't like the way that any thoughtful discourse by those we have elected to govern us is overtaken by verbal brawling. And I blame the media for it. You can hear the scare quotes just now when I referred to good television. Now, okay, this is just one small symptom, not in itself important, but then we are told that symptoms never are. I'm doubtful about this. But it is symptomatic of a process that I talked about somewhere else as the destruction of knowledge. A destruction of knowledge which, as an old-fashioned socialist and lifelong Marxist, I see as part of the death throes of what is now corporate capitalism.
So what was he saying? He's saying language is changing, it's evolving. In many ways influenced by technology. Not the bright picture that Edwin was trying to project in language's power, but the idea that meanings are becoming packaged in a succession of bite-sized chunks, the interpersonal becoming more explicit, the textual, the connections between ideas lost, like, just as he says, like the subtitles in a foreign language film. Thoughtful discourse overtaken by verbal brawling. Now, he says that he is a lifelong Marxist in his view. What influence has that had on his ideas about language? Well, he, as you should know, he talks about language and consciousness. It originates in the social nature of human activity. And that is also true from a Marxist perspective. And the idea that language is evolving, this evolutionary aspect of language and consciousness paralleling the evolution of human society over time in history. Marnie Halber on Politics of English says this: Marx makes it clear that the development of consciousness and therefore language was evolutionary. Language and consciousness evolve continuously over time. The evolutionary aspect of language and consciousness parallel the evolution of human society itself. In an interview that Halliday did, he said this, now with Firth, J.R. Firth was his mentor. With Firth, you see, it was very interesting because Firth was right at the other end of the political spectrum. There was, in fact, an interesting occasion when I went to be interviewed by him for a job at SOAS. It was after this interview, in fact, that Firth said, of course, you'd label me a bourgeois linguist. And I said, I think you're a Marxist. And he laughed at me. It seemed to me that, in fact, the ways in which Firth was looking at language, putting it in its social context, were in no way in conflict with what seemed to me to be a political approach. So it seemed to me that in taking what I did from Firth, I was not separating the linguistic from the political. It seemed to me rather that most of his thinking was such that I could see it perfectly compatible with, indeed, a rather necessary step towards what I understand as a Marxist linguistics. Halliday explains how when he came back to the UK in the 50s, and he was involved with this communist study group, what they began to think about was in the priorities in language and linguistics. And what concerned them was the fact that the highly valued forms, standard languages, written language, classical, formal, literary, all of these were being prioritized. They were defining what was language. Whereas language is also the dialects, it is also the spoken, it is also the colloquial, it is also the everyday. And this is what they wanted to reprioritize. What was language? What was the study of language? What is linguistics?
What I'm getting at is this. If you're particularly talking about study of language in Marxist terms, then you've got to look at it in relation to the society of which it comes from, essentially. So what is the what were the views of language that were then current in a non-Marxist, non-Marxist society, in our kind of society, right? And I think that the way to look at it is this: that in language studies and linguistics generally, there were certain priorities. And I'm going to look at my list of these, right? There was standard languages were privileged or prioritized over dialects. Written languages over spoken. Classical languages over modern ones. Formal language over colloquial. Dominant languages over emergent ones. Literary language over everyday language. Majority languages over minority languages. And that was always clear. Nowadays, of course, we would add things looking back and say things like we prioritize ideational meaning over interpersonal and so on. Okay. So now these are not clear-cut categories, and I'm certainly not saying that there was no work done under these the other headings. So there was lots of work in dialectology, there was work on minority languages and so on. But the view of language which was predominant was essentially that derived from all those highly valued forms of language rather than the others. So we wanted to really unpack that, examine it, and in the context in which we were working, which is the 1950s, we spent a lot of time, for example, on emerging language, on languages of ex-colonial societies which were struggling to gain their own status as national languages, like Swahili, like Yoruba, and so on. So that just was one particular way in which we, as it were, tried to put these notions into practice as to where the mainstream linguistics had actually come from. Which is not to say that you reject all its things at all, but you know, if you then reflect on the way that we represented grammar, for example, and all other features of language, you see that background there, where the ideas come from. So we wanted to give value to these forms of language which were, what was that nice phrase that somebody brought up in the 70s, of socially induced low visibility? I love that phrase. Yes. Forms of language of socially induced low visibility. Okay. So that, in a sense, is the background. Now, all I would say is that in my own background at that time, my own thinking at that time, I would say, yes, I was very definitely trying to adopt what I would consider a Marxist approach, and indeed I still would. But the problem is that so many people will have different interpretations of what that means. That certainly doesn't commit anyone who does systemic functional linguistics to work to be a left-wing in politics or anything of that kind. But that was part of the background, at least particularly in my own thinking. And so in that sense, I'm not at all saying Marxist means, as it were, there, even in embryo, in the words and the works of Marx himself. Much more in the sense of the ideology, if you like. Now, yes, in a sense that does, I don't think one can help this, that one's personal ideology, as it were, is going to affect one's work in science. Even if that ideology, so to speak, is precisely to say, well, you shouldn't let it. But even that is an ideological position, if you know it.
I like his quote. He says, if Marxist thinking means anything, it simply means clear and honest and objective thinking about, first of all, whatever it is that you are focusing your attention on. It is then that which indirectly, many steps away, is going to have, we hope, in the long run, some sort of effect, some sort of social impact is what he means here. Well, this is sort of the framework that we've been looking at language from. No, it's, yes, as he says, it comes from his way of looking at it, from his ideology, which is Marxist, yes. Does one have to be Marxist to apply it? No, but it does have is certainly an impact on the way that we look at language. It is something that we realize, the idea that we should have, in some sense, with our use of language, some way to be able to evaluate language, to be able to, as we said, compare its aesthetic and functional values of a text, and hopefully to have some idea of what is happening in our language. Is language evolving in a positive direction or not? This is a comment that he makes. But what I want you to be thinking about with reference to language is realize that it is something very powerful. It is something that is changing. It is something that is evolving. It is something that we use in order to make meaning, and is something that we use to inspire. It is something that we use to create art with, and it is something that we use to invent. And that purpose to which we put language shapes the language, much as the way we speak and the way we use language shapes the way we see the world. So this is our pretty much last content lecture. Next week I will go through and it will be primarily for review, and so in preparation for the exam. And so I won't be covering new material next week. This will be the end of sort of the content. Now, I have had a question that was asked me about grades about the midterm. Well, those were put up quite a long time ago already. If you should have seen your grades on Canvas and be able to see what grade you received for your midterm. So if you haven't, then please let me know. So, but grades were put up a while back. So, and so you don't have them? I thought that, sorry, just a moment. Anton, I thought that once they are put there, then it is made available, and am I missing some step?
Okay, so that may be a breakdown in communication between us. By default, on Canvas that will do that.
Yeah.
But I don't like that, so I turned it off.
Oh.
So that I could put all the things in and then look at them and then publish.
Okay. All right.
And so
that's fine. That's fine. But that so we
I
have.
can publish it right this second if you like.
Can you put those up? I'm sorry, guys. I thought you knew your midterm grades already. Thank you for raising the question, and so that we clarified that. Sorry, you've been waiting and not aware of what that.
Okay. So yeah. So sorry about that.
No, not your fault. Not your fault. I assumed that it was. I put that there, and then it went out. So, but now it's out.
Now it is out.
Now it's out. Okay. Done. All right, good. At least we got that cleared up. Okay, thank you, and see you next week. All right, so thank you. Goodbye.